So yeah, first of all, thank you for all joining me into this room. And it's, as I said, it's so beautiful to interact with your faces. The subject for our talk tonight is the unstoppable mystery of love. And of course, I suppose being the 15th, the first thing that our minds tend to, 15th of February, we tend to immediately think of romantic love, which I think is something that's very prevalent in our minds and our hearts and our thoughts, especially when we feel a little bit of a lack of something in our own lives. But that's certainly not what we're going to be discussing just yet. So we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive on the subject, and I want to suggest that when I speak about love itself, I'm going to use it in an interchangeable way. And what I mean by interchangeable is there are so many words to talk about some divine essence that is so much greater than us. And depending on which word you use, from deity to God to primordial to all the things we could use, I think it checks people out a little bit. And there's one absolutely fascinating thing. Some of you have had a transcendental experience. Some of you have had a full awakening. And I don't mean that it changes you permanently, but if you've ever had an experience where you feel like the deeper basement of reality has exposed itself to you, whether in prayer or whether in a psychedelic experience or whether in a deep fast or whatever it be, there is one thing that every single person reports is the absolute love, that the fabric of love that puts everything together. I can remember in some of my experiences that I've had, I could hear sounds and things, roads down, and no matter what was going down, even if it was someone screaming or if I could see a bug crawling across my wall, I knew that each one of those things is so perfectly orchestrated that absolutely nothing was out of reach of this fabric. Now, of course, you don't have to believe that, but I'm going to suggest that we're going to start a little bit of a bold journey. And that bold journey is to say that if you go from Confucius to Lao Tzu to Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, if you go to Hinduism, if you go to Gnostic Christianity, anywhere we want to go, the one thing that knits it all together is that they begin to immediately disagree once you've left the basement of love. But the one thing that we almost do not have a powerful spiritual system in the world that didn't base it in first on the fact that there is an incredible intelligence, and that this intelligence we are going to refer to as love. So the first challenge, if we can begin to really start to challenge ourselves straight away, I am going to make some really bold statements that some of you are going to want to throw out immediately, or you're going to feel triggered, and that's absolutely okay. And I want you to just try and travel with me and not to shut down over this next little while and just entertain the possibility of what's being said. So the first thing is, before we can even begin this journey about what makes this force of love and what it is and how it works in our lives, how we connect to it, God, how we interact with this actual being, then the first thing you have to decide, and it's one of the crises of our modern times, it is the existential threat of the modern lady and man, is, are we in a mechanistic universe, or are we in this absolute universe that is united by this fabric of love? So the higher soul, a higher intelligence, a higher, anything you want to call it, a quantum field. Now, why is this such a big question to ask immediately? Because if you look at the way we were all educated, I'm going to suggest that there is a major lie right out in plain sight. And that lie is so dark and so deceptive. And I'm not sure if it's something that somebody planned or if it's something that we've just done in our arrogance. But when it actually hits you, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's only those that take time to really study what happened in antiquity for us to realize this happened. So this is the lie. The lie is that most of us in this room, including me, believe that knowledge, true scientific understanding, true knowledge, only began when we dropped superstition and religion. That's the lie. That's the absolute lie. And I can tell you that I believed that for most of my life. So in other words, we got to a point where we eventually like, oh, we stopped with these superstitious religions and we started to actually figure out how science worked. And now we are at this incredible place because of, and that is the absolute lie. And I'm going to finish this by proving that to you, that nearly every single person that made a breakthrough beyond understanding for humanity was so connected to this love, to God, to devotion, that in actual fact, for thousands of years in China and everywhere in the world, but let's use China for an example, if someone showed that they wanted to study mathematics or something of the higher schools, all forms of knowledge were protected by the secret mystery schools or the churches or the organizations of devotion. In other words, they would actually go to the town of this young man who said he wanted to study one of these, what we call science, totally separate, apparently, to God. And what would happen is they would go and find out a whole lot of information about his nature and what he was like growing up, and do his peers like him? And you can go investigate this for yourself. And basically through, shall we call it the permission slip of his nature and the exuberance of the love and clarity and type of character that this individual brought into the world, a decision was made whether he was brought into the mystery school where he could study this thing, be it mathematics, astronomy, whatever it may be. So we're going to end up back where we started. And as the great poet said, we will end up where we started, but we shall know this place for the first time. And we will deepen this idea a little bit later on about the fact that only recently have we split spirituality and religion. And the split is devastatingly dangerous. And it is one that is happening within the schisms of our own psyche, hearts and minds as well. So this mechanistic universe is something that is born very recently. And essentially it is when we got this idea that perhaps all that was going on here was there's a lot of mechanical billiard balls, if you know what a billiard ball is, or snooker, just a lot of physical objects interacting mechanically with each other. And this is a very, very new idea. And it is also an idea that takes essentially the spirit and the soul right out of everything that you observe around you. What a magnificently scary thing to behold if everything you look around and everything you see, you believe are just things that are interacting with each other. Inanimate forces, hopefully not creating some pressure on your life, absolutely mechanistically, that would cause you to suffer. So that's the one possibility, and that's very much where science has gone. But why the subject is so enormous is the more we decided that the universe were made of these hard mechanistic things interacting with each other and forces, the more we've been able to not find essentially anything at the basement of reality. And we're not going to go too deeply into that, but you know, we all, even in the 80s and the 90s, we were taught that atoms were the basis of everything. And then we figured out that there is nothing inside an atom. There's a wave and a particle, and a wave is potential energy, and a particle is something that appears to exist, but that can disappear at any moment. I mean, it's absolutely bizarre. And anyone that's ever investigated it knows that if you are locked in the spell of looking around you in life and believing that this physical world is anything but waves of energy just choosing to show itself to you, then even science can lead you to this version of God. Quantum physics has become an incredible thing. So we left with this choice right at the beginning. I mean, is there a possibility that the thing I feel, which is when I walk along the beach and I close my eyes and I breathe, I feel a love and an intelligence that just flows through all things. When I'm in a beautiful space, when I listen to a piece of poetry, when I listen to some pieces of music, when I make breakthroughs within my own soul, there is just this absolute glowing, emanating love within all things to me. And the question and the crisis that most people have is whether this is, in actual fact, the basement of reality. And it is something that one can debate quite deeply. So to have a look at love and to have a challenging look at love, I am going to use specifically what is called the Neoplatonic philosophies. And the only reason I'm going to use that is because I've already suggested that all major religions that I've ever studied and all major mystics I've ever studied absolutely did not disagree on one simple thing, and that was that the basement, the fabric was love. The reason we're going to use the Neoplatonic philosophies, which obviously are all these incredible beings that were inspired after Plato's philosophies and for hundreds of years after, is because they were so obsessed with love once they decided that love was God. It was a frequency within you that was trying to speak to only those that wanted to close their eyes and listen to the eternal whisper. They became so obsessed with love that they bothered to spend 350 years, their students and the masters, literally creating 7 levels of love. So we're going to use those archetypes as a way to access potential devastating thoughts or beliefs in our lives right now. So I want you to understand that we're not selling a doctrine in any way, and I could switch this over to Buddhism at any point, but we would just have to change the lingo and the angle slightly. So that's a fascinating thing. What did the Neoplatonic era really have to actually say about the 7 levels of love? The first level of love, according to these great philosophers that spent their entire lives just looking to connect to the greater aspects and the greater wisdoms, was the love of God. Now, being the first level of love, it is also considered the only level of love, and it is considered that all other types of love emanate from this level. And of course, the love of God being what the Neoplatonics based most of their ethics, their morals, and their search for enlightenment through is a little bit of a controversial opening, because, I mean, what is God? And whether you consider this thing to be a person or a place or an idea, it doesn't really matter. And that is kind of your own journey. What is absolutely important to remember is that all these mystics agreed on the fact that there was this overmind, this fabric. And what's also fascinating when you understand this overmind, or this idea that the entire universe was fully conscious, and we believed this for thousands of years until recently, 100 years ago, a couple of guys went, no, actually, it's just stuff bumping together. And now we're advanced. Isn't that interesting? For thousands of years. And we also suggested that actually nearly everything we know from science actually was birthed or born of people trying to understand their relationship with God. In other words, it was born through the search for love. And I'm talking medicine. I am talking about mathematics. I am talking, and I will prove it to you. I won't just leave it as a big concept. So this is a fascinating idea now that we're sitting there with this fact that the most important love, or the most important expression that we should consume ourselves with daily, was the love of God, because we don't really know exactly what the love of God is. It was joked that our fall began, and this is a joke, I don't take it too seriously, but if you look at history and the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages and the Renaissance, it's often been joked that the fall and the rise of humanity was very much based on, I think Voltaire called it the Louis XV theory. And Louis XV, for those who don't know, was a little bit of a complex character. But what I mean by that is, if you think about how we see Jesus Christ and how we see a lot of these princes and things, a lot of it is very based on what's called the Monarch System. And what I mean is the king is against the wall to keep him safe, and whoever's second in charge is next to him. And The only thing that really teaches us is that we based a lot of our understanding on how the higher worlds would look, based on the monarch system, based on the fact that when humanity thinks about God, he has no idea what to equate it with other than his own structures. And he had a king, and he had a queen, and he had these kind of things. And it was very easy for him to almost archetypally build this in. So it's a fascinating thing. But where things get so interesting about this love of God is the idea to them was, like, for instance, the Hermetics or the Hermeticists, who I often speak of. Now, we are talking about the people that we can only track them from Alexandria. So this is ancient Egypt. We are talking about the people that literally brought chemistry, mathematics, and medicine into the modern world. And these individuals, in actual fact, it's such an amazing story to go and look at how many people, even to this day, are affected by Hermetics. But here's the interesting thing. As you look at my weird, shiny head, because I can see it in the top corner there too, there is a brain inside here. And I almost feel like I should say something sarcastic there. But within this organism of my brain, according to the Hermetics or the Hermeticists, the entire universe was represented inside my brain. In actual fact, another way of putting it is that everything that exists within the kingdom of God is expressed as a microcosm within me. And this is the way they explain the forces of darkness and light that you would have to unify within your life. And that is why that as a mere human being, you would know the struggles of gods. And this permeated right through culture. For thousands of years, we believed that in some way, we were like a small representation. And even for the scientists in the room, if you think about it, it's an extraordinary thing to consider that for all of reality, things could not really choose to be anything other than what they were. So an example is, I don't think a cricket can wake up and decide that he's not a cricket anymore and that he's going to be a moth today, or a bee doesn't decide that it's in a bad mood and that it's not going to be anymore and it's just going to go sit on the beach and take things easy. And why these are important distinctions, as humorous as they are, is because we have this extraordinary thing as a human being sitting in your chair right now, is you have a choice to be the monster, and you are the monster. And you have a choice to be in this divine expression of love, and you are that too. You have a choice to be the bumblebee. You have a choice. It's the most magnificent thing to ever think about, that the very thing that is our downfall is our absolute gift. As much as we can be pulled into the darkness, we can reach for the highest heights. And it's a magnificent thing to think about. So what does this have to do with anything? They believed that your number one thing was your love of God. Now, unfortunately, this got changed later on into the church, and it got twisted into a love of what we say God says. I want you to know that for thousands of years, the Rosicrucians, the Gnostics, even the Gnostic Christians, they did not believe this to be the case. They simply believed that this was not something that could be translatable into rules. It was a way of being. And that if you got this way of being right with sincerity, which they believed was the key to unlocking the divine within you, that if you got this love of God right, that everything else in your life would align. So then the question that comes is, what are you loving? Well, let's listen to what all these masters said. Lao Tzu, even the creators of even Zen Buddhism, spoke about how they didn't believe specifically Zen, but in the soul being a separate thing. That everything you observe is your soul. Everything that you see around you is an outer expression of your soul. If we look at the Hermetic laws of the cosmic universe, they talk about everything that's within is without. It can only be within because it's without. In other words, if you exist within you, you also exist within everything without you. As above, so below. And all those beautiful cosmic laws. And this becomes a fascinating thing, because what would this mean if we got out of the brain a little bit? It would mean that your relationship with your life is your relationship with God. It would mean that the relationship with people around you, from beggars to the most ugly person in your life, the way that you perceive society, the way that you perceive animals, the way that you feel about fish, about absolutely everything is an aspect of your soul outplaying. Now, if this was true, who, as I'm not going to keep listing them from Hinduism, Buddhism, if this is true, then what that means is that we are in the middle of a mighty spell indeed. Because the spell that most of us are in are that we are trapped inside this clay physical form, and that everything we're observing around us has nothing to do with this divine God that we so deeply ache for, and that essentially we're just biding our time around these other arseholes, if we're dead honest, and so that we can get out of here as soon as possible. And I tell you, if the people that created the philosophies that I'm sharing with you were correct, I'm also going to tell you these same people what they brought to the world and how they changed the world. Well, then we're in a mighty pickle indeed, because as many of the Zen philosophers have explained, if you can perceive that you are inside here, the only reason that you can perceive that is because you are outside there. If you can perceive that you are separate, the only way you can perceive that you are separate is to understand that there must be a consciousness external to you and that you are both of those things balanced. So we don't need to get too confused, but what does that tell us? It tells us that maybe your relationship with everybody in your life really, really means something. Your relationship with your body, according to, for instance, the Paracletics, they believed that your body was the representation of the universe, and the way you treated it was the way that you were interacting with reality. So this is the first potential of love that we spoke about. We speak about the possibility that if we could get this relationship down, well, our experience of life would be completely different immediately. So number one, according to the Neoplatonists, is the love for God. And what a magnificent idea. I absolutely love it. Now, where it gets really interesting for me, because we're not going to do all of them. We're only going to do 2 of them, and we'll flitter over the others, and then we'll get a little bit more controversial just to challenge ourselves a little bit. Number 2, or the second most important thing in their lives, they believe could almost not be separated from number 1. It is the love of wisdom. Not truth, not education, not knowledge. This is where things get interesting later on. The love of wisdom. And wisdom, wow, what a magnificent idea. Wisdom would be this idea, first of all, that there is this infinite wisdom inside the deity or the Godhead or the essence of all things that perhaps was beyond our ability to even encapsulate or understand. And then, of course, the wisdom that we knew lay within us because of the fact that we understood that the divine expresses from within us. And this love of wisdom was such a big driver in society. There was, I think it was Voltaire who said that when people were trying to logic the universe, and he actually said such a simple statement that you just don't understand that God does not owe you anything to make sense to you, and neither does reality. And it was said by many philosophers that the more you go into your logical mind and try and find simple rules and understandings for how things work, the more lost you would feel, because always slightly behind the logical mind is the divine expression of love, giving, taking, pushing, pulling, and growing. And what was so beautiful about this love for wisdom was it was basically a love for the God feeling, God ability, the God action. In other words, how one would express in life if he were to be connected to this love all the time. It's an incredible conversation about wisdom because it brings up such a controversial subject, and it's something that I spoke about when we spoke about the power of prayer. And this is the subject. When you talk about wisdom, the first thing that starts to happen is people try and interpret wisdom, and they try and interpret God's will. And most of the evil that has ever been done in this world is when one man, probably very sincerely basking in the absolute love, having the first principle down, the love of God, the love of his environment, the love of all beings, as Buddha would put it. He saw this whole thing exactly the same as the Platonists. And then what's so magnificent about this experience then is if you begin to tap into this God wisdom, where does the wisdom of how the divine works and the wisdom of man meet? Well, that is where most of the problems in the universe start. Because once we started writing down what we thought we interpreted as his laws or her laws or whatever this magnificent being is, well, that's where the problem starts. So the love of wisdom was not the love of law. The love of wisdom was, like for instance, we have a very strange way of seeing worship nowadays. Many of us have come from environments where our religions essentially, if we're very honest, tormented us. And our religions created such a toxic perspective in our lives that we were forced to completely throw the bath out with the the baby out with the bathwater. But an example is worship. Now, worship in a lot of modern spirituality is considered quite a terrible energy. Why worship that thing that you are actually just a part of? And I can understand that it's a semantic argument. But worship itself was getting present or getting strong in the faith of the wisdom that was just out of reach. That's what worship was. It was knowing that I can't fully in my brain comprehend exactly why this is unfolding the way it is. But if I just connect to that love and that wisdom, I know that all is in perfect action and divine flow. And even if we're not feeling it right now, God, what a feeling. There's just no better feeling. I call it the peak human experiences. Oh, it's fucking magnificent. It's magnificent. Just that in the middle of the chaos, maybe the biggest dark night of your soul, and you just get that moment of clarity, sometimes hours of clarity, where you just cannot believe how perfect things are. And as that love and that perfect essence starts to slip away and you start to believe in the chaos again, you know that it's there. And worship and prayer and faith, they're such beautiful things to just go on your knees in such a deep essence, not giving your power over to something, not just the way we've been we've literally been poisoned against religion. We have, and religions have done it for us. But oh, there's so much more there than we realize. To be on your hands and knees and to just be like, I cannot fully comprehend these next steps. It's such a beautiful thing. I surrender. I give myself unto you, unto myself. I am that I am. And where this becomes fascinating is that this is where the first level where the ego can become involved. And we're not going to talk about the ego, but I want you to consider that people that become quite dangerous, in my opinion, and this is controversial, a lot of people I know is, they begin to claim to know the will of God or to speak for God. And that's where the trouble really, really starts. Instead of teaching that person how to fall in love with God, love, whatever you want to call it, so to be in this, basking in this understanding, and instead of teaching that person to search for wisdom and to understand the wisdom that is behind things, we start telling them how we should translate it. And we're left with concepts and these silly little things like words. Just think about how I've spent like half an hour trying to explain love, and just think about how the word love it's just a word. It means nothing. It's a concept. It doesn't encapsulate anything. So it's a fascinating thing, the search for wisdom. And what's so fascinating is that I want you to consider for yourself in your search for wisdom is that what most of the philosophers discovered right from the original ancient shamans was that right at the core of the wisdom of the divine unfolding is cycles of birth and death inbuilt in all things, the beginning and the ending of all things, and the constant rebirthing of those same things. We see it in the planets, we see it in the sun, we see it in the ocean, we see it in animals, we see it in birth cycles, from celestial, heavenly, right to bacteria. Everything is replicating and improving. You want to call it, what's that word that we use now on Earth? Such an interesting word. We came from chimps. What's the silly thing? Anyway, yeah. So why that's such a powerful thing to consider is if you look at the deaths and the births within your own life, you will understand that just because we are not completely connected to the wisdom of how that pain and how we perceived as loss, how the perfection of it in action was. And that is where prayer and worship, and I told you my version of worship is surrendering my egoic mind, my arrogant need to pretend I know, suffering so dearly because I need to understand, letting that go. Oh, it's magnificent. It's absolutely magnificent. So yeah, it's a huge thing. And then ask yourself, when you observe things around you, are you really observing chaos, or are all things in a birth and death cycle? And will all things be born anew and a stronger in a kind of intelligence and a blueprint that we don't really understand? Oh, what a magnificent thing. So that is the search for wisdom. And as I said, we're not going to do all of them. But what I'd really like to speak about just onto the search for wisdom is Neoplatonic philosophers, Plato philosophers, Hermetics, all these guys, they all spoke about the interchange between your inner reality and this divine essence of love. And I want to simplify this for you. Let's stop the bus. Sitting right there where you are, there's a lot of thoughts and feelings inside you. Sometimes it's a good day. Sometimes it's a bad day. Sometimes you have the darkness of all hell running through you. And sometimes, wow, the ideas, creativity of all light. And I want you to consider something. They believed for thousands of years up until recently that the universe at its core is integrous. I want you to think about that for a reason. That love basically involves action. But what I'm saying is that the universe, even when you don't understand, is working in perfect integrity. And that the only way to truly be living and basking in the principle, the first principle, which is the love of God, is to have that same integrity inside you. So there's a lot of bullshit that we speak about in modern day. We say things like, like, why does all the bad stuff happen to all the good people? It's not true. It might appear true on the surface, but I want you to challenge yourself. I want you to push away what you actually think you believe. And I want you to just for a second ask yourself, have you ever gone through a stage? Be deeply honest with yourself. Maybe you've just read a religious book. Maybe you've just got the latest spiritual book. Maybe you've just spent time with a guru. Maybe you've just had a mind-expanding experience. And suddenly you are so filled with that love that you behave differently in thought and in honesty with the world around you for a period. And during that period, the world responds completely differently to you. According to these men and women of antiquity, the honesty within you, the integrity within you, was literally the inner reflection of your relationship to God itself. An example, if you want me to give you an example, when Plato was asked about what we call self-esteem nowadays, or soul-esteem, I think was more in the conversation of this particular scroll. He said that self-esteem is something, or soul-esteem is something I seem to have disappeared there. Can you guys hear me? Am I back? Okay.
Yes.
Awesome, thanks. I don't know where I disappeared. So this idea, it is so enormous, this idea that actually being a good person, being integrous, being in honesty, being in alignment is actually a way of building this vibration or this frequency within you. We are so disconnected from reality that we've begun to believe that that which we experience within us is completely devoid to the outside world or the higher intelligences, kind of like a secret box where we can just be as narcissistic and as self-obsessed and upset as we want about everything that we don't understand around us. And it's quite a magnificent thing to consider that these many philosophers meet at that point where they're saying that your relationship with the universe outside of you starts with the integrity within you. And if you don't believe me, I want you to do an experiment. I want you to try it in your life. I want you literally, like Buddha said, Buddha didn't use the word love. He always spoke about kindliness. The reason for this is he believed that there were so many variations of love, even angry love, that human beings had come up with, but somehow the word kindliness was very hard to interpret in a difficult way. But I want you to just try it for yourself. So I'm actually not saying that you shouldn't have negative thoughts. I'm not saying you shouldn't be anxious and panicked. I'm not saying that you don't have the cosmic spectrum of all the universe tearing within you, just as gods do. I'm just literally saying that consider that when you say something to someone and you keep the integrity of that word, that even though it appears you have interacted with something outside of you, you perhaps have just aligned with the piece of yourself. And it's not about being a savior. It's just about being in integrity. Integrity can be that you can't help at that time, or that you do not think it would be suitable to help at that time. Love is a very special thing. Can you imagine if our secret world was actually not so secret, and you begin to realize that reality is actually responding to your own moral and ethic interaction with the world around you? And I'll leave with you that for you to meditate on. So we're not going to do the rest, but the next one, specifically for the Neoplatonics, was love of tribe, was number 3. Now, amazing. They got that out the way. And I think it was 3 or 4 years you had to study just how to live and bask in the love of God. And they never told you what God was. It's kind of like, if I could give you a little thing before we move on, it was equated by the great Lao Tzu that you would walk around as though you were in absolute love. You would walk around as though the greatest lover of your entire existence was winking at you from every flower and blowing across your face on every breeze. The feeling of being absolutely enrapturously in love. When you are in love romantically, you hopefully love the difficult parts of that person too. And it was the same thing, that the structures of birth and death and suffering and growth happening all around you, and that you holding the secret fragrance within your soul could walk around absolutely and totally in love with this thing that nowadays we have decided does not even yet exist. And yet we sit right within it right at this moment. So then was love of tribe. And I'm not going to go too deeply into that. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory, but it was many years of study that they did on each one. But I don't think it's that important for this evening. But basically, it was how you interact with your society and how you kept the laws. So only at this level did they begin to create law. And the law was never, ever considered to be God's law. The law was always admitted to be man's law. And man was, first of all, bowing to the wisdom of what was truly wise. And law would be a reflection of the wisdom and not the other way around. So then was the love of light. The love of light. Now, this is very, very misunderstood thousands of years ago, because we like to believe, especially what I call us light and love bunnies, that just want to focus on everything that's pretty and are so scared about this darkness within us. The love of light, if you go and study it for yourself, was the love of illumination. It was this idea that what light truly is when the wisdom that we spoke about, which is only found if you live in the love of God, that this wisdom would illuminate that there is actually more clarity to what you are beholding than you first realized. So the love of light was the love of illumination, was the love of sitting on a beach and suddenly in your love realizing what was actually going on, or the feeling of closing your eyes in rapturous song or prayer and knowing that you were part of a greater purpose pattern than you could ever explain. So you see how beautifully these things all tie. So the love of light was not the love of good, and it was not the love of bad. It was the love of the illumination of the understanding how all things, good and bad, outplaying, resulted in a fabric of love that ended up serving all of those that were involved. What a magnificent idea. And we believed this for thousands of years. And we are sitting so lost right now. And it has a lot to do with the fact that we began to split our search for knowledge and wisdom from our search for God. And we'll get to that in a moment. So just for interest's sake, then was a love of beauty. Was number 4 or 5. Oh, such a magnificent thing. Also very misunderstood today. I can't say that I studied this one much. One of my favorite philosophers, Manly P. Hall, speaks quite extensively about the love of beauty. And he basically, in his words, he speaks about how all of these things only worked if you were in love with God. And he goes across thousands of years of history and he shows how artists, I mean, guys, look at most Renaissance art. Look at most art. It's divinely inspired. Look at the Sistine Chapel. I mean, I could just sit here and name places. Most great, even Chinese artists. For thousands of years, the Chinese were considered to have the most incredible art. But basically, a person could sit at a river for 6 months observing the sea before he even made the first stroke. And maybe within 4 strokes, he would create this magnificent that would be beheld for an era. But the thing that I want us to identify was that all of these endeavors, whether for the quest for knowledge or whether for the quest for beauty, were done with that essence or that love of God within you constantly. So in other words, if you go and Google and spend the next week going to investigate all your favorite artists from thousands of years ago up until recently, you're going to discover that there were deeply religious people without fail, especially the ones that really, really, really broke through. I'm trying to think of what's his name. Yeah, like guys, the most prolific artists had a deep relationship with the divine. And this once again keeps right to the point here. So I'm suggesting through using the Neoplatonic guys, I'm suggesting once again that our breakthroughs in all these areas actually only happened because of this deep relationship that they had. And what a magnificent thing. So that's the love of beauty. Another way of put it would be, it is the love for perfectionism that unfolds in the morality or the integrity of what you observe. Such a beautiful thing. Then the next one, the second last one, was the love of skills. I absolutely love this because, I remember hearing a story once where I think his name, there's a very famous violin player. What was his name? Famous guy, Anton Stratovarius or something like that. He was like one of the greatest violin makers of all time. And someone asked him, Anton, why do you make violins? And he said, because God made Anton to make violins. And this really is something we've lost. Do you know how proud people were to be a shoemaker? It was passed down from one person to the next person, like it was a skill. And if you were the greatest shoemaker in the city, you were touched by God. This is not my opinion. I want you to go and research this. You could not be the master of any craft unless you were tapping into the wisdom and the inspiration and the creativity of that which explodes from every human being. For thousands of years, from the earliest history, we know that human beings reached out for each other for connectivity and love and for something deeper. This has been right at the core of ourselves. So this is the most fascinating thing. We begin to start having a very sobering experience. And what is the experience? we're starting to realize, because we haven't even got to science yet, that perhaps it could be true that all of our great breakthroughs regarding art and creativity were divinely inspired. How would you know if it's true? If you don't want to take my word for it, go and research. Take about 50 artists that have blown your mind or that you cannot believe, and go and read a little bit about kind of what their process was and how they got there. You don't need to really get too complicated. If you can do yourself a favor and go and walk into a gallery, go and walk into a very famous gallery, and what do you notice? What is possibly one of the most #1 painted things in all galleries? Angels and human beings and celestial interchanges between angels and human beings and devils and angels and archetypes, and literally art is inspired by the divine essence or this war within man. And then the last one was love of family. What a beautiful thing. I find this one really, really challenging because, first of all, I'm a bit of a lone wolf and I don't really live within a family unit. But the idea here, the idea here would be that your relationship with your family would be the microcosm of this divine experience unfolding. So, like, for instance, Lao Tzu spoke about the fact that the father and the son and the mother and the daughter and the whole family unit, especially with the parent to the child, should be able to deal with all their conflict with a divine inspiration. In other words, if we could give an example of understanding a way to access higher states or God himself, would be, for instance, that sometimes the mother or the father make decisions that the child cannot understand, and that there is a conflict because the childlike mind, the childlike heart, or that being who cannot hold the full story would have quite a savage response to some of the decisions that the child made. And can we equate this to our own lives with the divine essence? But why Lao Tzu went on about this was he said that essentially it is only in a home that is run with the love of God. And once again, you can take that as religious, or you can go, okay, we're talking about an integrity. This could be taught to my children and to my family without even bringing up a religion. We're talking about a feeling, an integrity, a flow within all things. But basically, he was saying that it was only in the presence of the love of God that our families could actually deal with these conflicts, just as we have no idea of why the divine expression makes the decisions or allows things to unfold exactly how it is. We only figure it out in hindsight, and then we smile and we are thankful to the parent that stood their ground when we tantrumed and when we were afraid because we wanted something right now. So yeah, that's absolutely mind-blowing 7 things that, and I didn't want to do them all because it would go on for too long, and we've already been going on for about 45 minutes. What's very, very fascinating is that if we look at, I mentioned in Buddhism, because another way, I was actually originally going to do this through Mahayana Buddhism. It doesn't matter what archetype you use. You know, if you start studying religions, you just get mind blown. These guys are not actually disagreeing with each other. Nearly all agree, they all agreeing totally with each other about the love of God, the love of wisdom, the love of reality. It's only when it gets to the translation between the man and the higher self that all the trouble starts. In other words, where we create a building and we try and create rules, that's where the trouble starts. Where we created a building between ourselves and the heavens. So that's where things get interesting. So in Buddhism, very much the same doctrine from Gautama, but he didn't like to use the word love so much because he said that there were so many different kinds of love and that most of them are expressed through the human mind. In other words, we try and build it through our character. And it was something that Buddha and many of the others understood deeply as well, that even when we try and access God, we can only access it through our understanding of humanity, which is kind of how we ended up building God as royalty, you know, like there's a guy on the throne, and because that's the structure that we've had for a few thousand years, so it made sense to us. It's very hard for us to let go of that and to realize that there is nothing between us and what is unfolding right now. So it's a beautiful thing. So the word he used was kindliness. The reason I want to bring that up is because at the core of Buddhism is a very famous saying that very roughly translates, says that if you could overturn just 1/16 of your heart, it would be far more important than your entire mind. And why it's so important is basically Buddha was saying that just a slightly open heart, just a person living in a 16th of their heart, it would be more important that you lived with an I disappeared again. I'm not sure why. So Buddha thought it would be more important to live with an expanded heart than it would be no matter what you could do with the power of your mind. And I think this is a very, very important point to start bringing us towards how we're going to close, because I want you to consider how desperately lost we are, because I'm gonna have a real go at spirituality now. And I can tell you that we have this idea, we are literally possessed by our minds. We are possessed by concepts. We are possessed by information. And we have this idea that what an awakening is, it's absolutely bizarre. What an awakening is to get hold of the internet or a friend or a book that will give you a much more complex variation of what could be going on behind the scenes. And now you are more opinionated and you have a bigger story than anyone else. That's apparently an awakening. It's fascinating. And now we have hundreds of millions of people worldwide arguing about how woke they actually are and what God's trying to say. And essentially most of them just become so lost in chaos because everything is out to get us. The more woke you are, the more awake you are, the more the evil things are working against us. Never mind if we just pause there for a second, that for thousands of years, they did not believe in intrinsic evil. And if you're not sure what intrinsic evil is, it would be the idea that some evil exists outside of the fabric of reality. In other words, that there is something that is not of God. Now, if you do not believe in intrinsic evil, you cannot believe how courageous you can be. Because even in my work, we have to face some really dark things and see some really terrible things that can happen to human beings. I can tell you that it's effortless to put my hand of love on them because I do not believe in intrinsic evil, because nothing exists outside the monad, the one, nothing. They are just simply energies that are expressing an absolute perfection beyond the understanding of my own wisdom. And that's a really, really big thing to think about and what we think this modern awakening is. Because first of all, we certainly are not walking around in the love of God. We're not. We're not. I can tell you now that if you have a high level of anxiety or a high level of mental illness, that's got nothing to do with your relationship with God. That's not what I mean. The love of God would be to find a way to deal with anything that's dealt to you. Joan of Arc was mentally ill. I can give you so many people that were mentally ill that changed the world. They certainly didn't stop and go, oh, well, I'm obviously not a child of God because I am sick or I'm epileptic or I'm panic disordered it's just that the love of God is to realize that you cannot bask in the love of God unless you believe that everything is as it should be. So this awakening, I'm afraid, is a mighty big mistake. And what I mean by mistake is that I believe that they've glimpsed slightly bigger possibilities of reality, and that we've all agreed that that's an awakening. So we're all sitting around pretending that we're awoke, whatever the hell that word even means. And it's certainly not there in action, because I mean, look how enlightened people supposedly, I don't believe I've ever met an enlightened person. I'm not sure if it even exists. I think that it's a quest for something that's a little bit toxic. Why can't we be human? If I am God and I am sitting amongst gods and parts of myself, teaching myself something, why would I want to be anywhere more than where I am right now? Unless I don't really believe that I am sitting in that perfection of God, which means I am not in the first law, the love of God. And we can go round and round and round to see how these philosophers did this. But let me simplify this for you. I am suggesting, I'll give you an example, okay? Pythagoras. Pythagoras He's one of the most remarkable men that has ever walked this planet. He was fully enlightened, if there was such a thing, the way we use it modern day. Now, when I say Pythagoras, okay, so this is, I said at the beginning, we were going to discuss the possibility that we have literally been lied to, or we're lying to ourselves about where knowledge comes from. First thing you think about Pythagoras is you think about mathematical formulas and things like that, right? Paracelsus, the godfather of chemistry, the first thing you think of when you think of him is he created sulfur. Oh no, he discovered sulfur. And we could go on and on and on. Now, what's absolutely fascinating is if you look at Pythagoras, the first thing he taught his students was the fact that the transmutation of the soul, in other words, how he could prove reincarnation was real through numbers, that no matter how you built the mathematical system, it would always get to an end point and regenerate itself, exactly like the birth and death of all things that are unfolding around you. And yes, in the death of things, in the release of things, there is often pain. And in the birth of things, there is often a new embracing of an awakening and possibility. So what I'm trying to say is Pythagoras wrote probably 999 pages to one page about maths versus God. Most of what he's written about is God. And if you go, and I challenge you to go and investigate this. So he also came from the Alexandria Hermetic secret schools, the Greek schools and the Hermetic schools. It's very well known in history that they linked, and that the Greeks, when they got to their point of being at the absolute Mecca, disappeared into Alexandria, which was in Egypt, to go and study the mystery schools. And they came out with mystic kind of perceptions. So why I'm saying this, guys, and we're just using Pythagoras, is Pythagoras believed that every single number was an expression. There's an entire lecture he wrote about one, and the one is God, and all is contained in the one. This is why I didn't believe in intrinsic evil either. And that all things that will ever encompass are within that one. Then he talks about two. He has an hour and a half, I don't know how long it would take you to read it, lecture about two. And the two is the split that takes place in man. And that man is then, I mean, this is a guy that we were taught in school was a mathematician. One of the most enlightened, Jesus kind of level dudes that ever existed. We have stripped knowledge to such a degree that we have convinced people in universities that this knowledge came from scratching around like a scientist, trying to split atoms, to the point where he discovered, wow, that numbers can coincide with geometry, and geometry coincides with the intelligence of life design. They don't tell you that these guys were committed to God, and that in their commitment to God, in meditations and in divine inspirations, they got glimpses of what numbers mean and of how numbers could link to. Same thing with Paracelsus. He was a highly enlightened man who gave us chemistry. It would take us too long, but I could do this with medicine. Medicine came from a few highly enlightened people that were obsessed for their venerable drive to live in the love of God, which was why we spoke about it so long. And where does that leave us as a modern society? That leaves us that the Masonic, the Hermetic, all of these secret temples for thousands of years were allowing the information of how the magic is put together. Science and spirituality being the same thing. Science literally just being where you begin to work out how a particular spell in the middle of a magnificent miracle was particularly cast. That's all that science was. Alchemy became chemistry. Alchemy would be God's involvement in the whole thing. And suddenly, 200 years ago, we left with chemistry. Now it's got nothing to do with God. Absolutely nothing to do with God. It's literally just like, well, if you mix a few things, you can have an explosion. And if you mix quite a few things, you can, that's modern chemistry. It's got nothing. And if you go and watch just because we don't know before that, for 4,000 years, every person who is considered a contributor towards chemistry itself he discovered what he discovered in his search to understanding how God was within him. That is what alchemy is. Some people called it the gold. The gold was consciousness. They were in search for that. And recently we decided, oh, they were actually just trying to make gold. So if this is true, what I'm suggesting is I'm suggesting that for thousands of years, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, wisdom, knowledge, information has been held by those that are in the love of the most wise. And something happened recently, and we've decided we live in a mechanistic universe, and that knowledge has nothing to do with your relationship with God, and that the integrities that you hold within you, the honesties, and the integrities you hold with the people around you, and the integrities that you hold with life have nothing to do with your greater experience of how life is unfolding for you and how you are experiencing what you think is external to you. This is a magnificent thing to consider. It's a magnificent thing to consider, because it would mean that we are in deep shit. It would mean that knowledge now is held. If you think about it, knowledge is now held by those that stand the furthest from God. And we feel safe about that. I can tell you now that when I want to know exactly how a specific atom or something works, I don't care what the guy's religious status is. I can tell you I don't. I'm like, I think good scientists would probably understand. I mean, Einstein said that he was the last era of the great hermeticists that started to slip so much into the mind that he wasn't sure. Einstein said that if you could have one wish, it would be to all completely believe in God. He wasn't sure. He knew there was a fabric, but not this God that we were selling. So my point is, where does that leave us? Well, we have this idea, like whether it's Lisa or Lauren Lee or Amy sitting in this room, we have this idea that if we're going to begin to improve ourselves, that it would have nothing to do with being in love. That we could pick up a book and we could read philosophy and we would not need the divine to give us the wisdom of it. Or that we could read a spiritual book, just completely like, yeah, bugger my neighbor and everyone's an arsehole, but I'm going to read my spiritual book at 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock. You know, you can compartmentalize my spiritual growth. And it's an incredible thing because you realize that actually we are, if Pythagoras was correct, and we are a spirit that's going to keep recreating from the number 10 back to 1 and just keep improving into a more and more complex. He even used geometry to show how your soul grows with each life. Didn't you wish they told you this in high school? Did you wish? Because now you're all going to go Google. There's no ways Pythagoras spoke about this. I want you to. I'm leaving carrots all over the place. I want you to. I want you to go and find out if where we got medicine from was from a bunch of religious fanatics or not. And it was. They were religious fanatics. In actual fact, it has been said by Voltaire, who we mentioned earlier, that in actual fact, things like medicine malpractice never existed. And arguments amongst the law in Rome never existed until we got to the point where we tried to separate knowledge from the relationship with God. And for thousands of years, secret mystery schools, churches, monasteries, where do you think the scrolls have lived until 100 years ago? In monasteries, and you had to earn the right for that knowledge. And we are now in a world where we are filled with concepts, filled with science, but anybody who studies science will tell you that science has been stuck for over 40, 50 years. We're stuck, can't move forward. We're figuring out a little thing about the planets, and then we're figuring a little bit about this, but essentially we're stuck because once we figured out we don't know what's at the basement of reality, we now got trillion-dollar machines where we watch particles bumping against each other, hoping that we can make sense. Every few months, we're naming a new neutrino. We've got a new theory. But essentially, what we're looking at is quantum madness with absolutely no way of understanding how it's interacting and how the fact that reality is only there when it chooses to be. So I would go as bold as to go that if we as a society are to find our way back, and I have no idea how it looks, I believe it will be cracked through people that once again go back to the first principle of Neoplatonism, the love of God. And that only in the presence of the love of whatever this divine expression is, will people make the breaks in science, in in every area that I can possibly think of. That's the thing that's missing. Because when you're within that love, everything you do is for your tribe. Everything you do is for your family. Everything you do is for the greater expansion. How magnificent. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave us. I think it's a magnificent thing. I think the biggest thing for me has been the experiment of whether it is true that life is chaos around you, or could that be my soul? Could that be all the outplaying of my soul? And I've tried it with a kind of integrity. I've tried to be so honest in my life. I don't mean my whole life, trust me. But I've tried to be so blunt and so honest about my downfalls and my strengths. And I found the more of an integrity that I bring to things around me, the more I'm beginning to see the divine expressing in things. And I think that they were right all along. And I think your relationship with one thing is your relationship to all things, because all things are one thing. And to point a finger and to be in the supposed awakening where there are all these forces after you is to believe in intrinsic evil, which means that you are separating the parts of this magnificent mechanism that don't suit you so that we can have someone to blame. Or we could believe that we are in the midst of the most perfect, self-equating, I like that, self-equating, that this thing all bottoms out into an absolute perfect equation. And like it has been for millions of years, the answer will be a whole new level of love. So I leave those thoughts with you. I do believe that even if this is confusing for you, the key is this simple for me: sincerity. I close my eyes and I get flooded with all the nonsense of this spiritual group and that spiritual group, and this group says the aliens are after me, and that group says the demons are after me, and this group says that, and this group says the scientists have got to save us, and my head is so loud and I don't know what to do, and I'm having an anxiety attack, and I'm not sure if that's because I'm a bad person, and it's so confusing. And then I just go into sincerity. And sincerity is, God, I call you. God, I don't need to understand. God, I feel you. God, hold me. Hush, hush.